Hi everyone, welcome to Frankenstein's Fabrics Mystery Block 12, and this is the inner sashing assembly video. So apologies for taking forever to get around to this. We have had a run. So in the last few weeks I've had a lot of technological speed humps. My quilting machine blew a switch, and I had to wait a couple of weeks for my mechanic to be available. He was away and then he had COVID, and it's just been one of those things. And then my phone died, which is the thing I used to film everything on. So I was having trouble with battery issues, and it was up, down, all over the place, duplicating things and just not capable of coping with filming. So we're finally here. And today we're looking at the assembly of the inner, joining our blocks together. We're not going to worry about the outer border just at this point. That'll be a quick next video, but it is in the same vein as this one here. So what you'll need is your 12 blocks pressed, threads trimmed, everything like that. You will then need to pick your sashing fabric. Now I have gone with a black and white stripe because I want a high contrast between my blocks and my sashing. So depending on what fabrics you've chosen for your blocks, you will need either a contrast or something that will blend, depending on how you want your blocks to either stand out or maybe blend in a little and then contrast with your border. So think about that. Now my border, just grab that, is going to be my candy corn. So that's why I've gone that way. And I'm actually going to bind in hot pink to pick up on the few pinks that I did use in my blocks. So this is all like very contrast look. So first things first, we need to talk about fabric for your sashing. So I have picked a black and white stripe because I want it to be directional. So I want all of the stripes to run down my quilt. Now, in order to do that, I've had to cut a length of fabric that's far more than I need, because I need my vertical sashings, so my two outer ones and my two inner ones, and I'll explain a bit more about that later, is that they run, this stripe runs parallel to the selvage. So in order to compensate for my directionality, I've had to cut in a few different weird ways. So what I've done is I've calculated roughly what size strips I will need for each of my sections. Now this is my rough notes, but this will give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So the layout of your quilt is 12 blocks. So I'm doing a 3 across and a 4 down because the other way makes it a little bit weird, and I don't want to make more blocks to make it 4 by 4. I want to stick to the 3 by 4. So if you do a rough calculation, each block is 12 inches. My sashing is cut at 2.5, which means it'll be 2 inches. So I can go and calculate that I'm going to need a length of, and I can figure it out that way. So what I've worked out here is that I need 9 of the strips to go in between my blocks that are in the main part of the quilt. I need 2 horizontal strips that are my borders, so that's the top and the bottom, 2 vertical strips to go inside, and 2 vertical strips to be my outer borders. So what I have done is my black and white runs along parallel to the selvage. So what I did first was I cut fabric B. So back to here, fabric B is my 2 horizontal strips, so my top and bottom border. Now I know that seems counterintuitive because I'm not cutting the bit I'm going to sew first, but this means that I now have my 2 borders, so top and bottom border, with my stripes going down, and I've left the selvages on because this piece is actually bigger than what I need, and I will come back to that in a little bit. I then laid out my fabric, so it's so I cut 2 strips. I actually cut off a bolt, so if you're going to buy fabric and you're going to you're going to follow what I'm doing with the horizontal, the parallel to the selvage with a strip, you will need to buy, it's a little bit more than 1.5 meters. It's something like 1.75 ish. I'll fix that calculation in the notes. But if you want to do that, it means what you need to do is you need to cut the top and bottom border strips off the fabric first. Then you cut fabric D, which is your 2 biggest borders. And I've cut these with scissors because I could follow the stripe. So I've got 2 that are like this, and as you'll see here, I actually have a white on either edge. That's just how the 2.5 inch fell. And then I also have 2 strips that have a black on the edge. Now I'm going to decide at some point, now these strips are all the same length at the moment because I cut them off the length of fabric. I'm going to decide which one I'm going to put as my 2 inner strips and my 2 outer strips later. I'm not going to worry about the black white thing just at the moment, but I'm going to keep them together in a pair so that it matches. So what I'm talking about here is the 2 inner strips and the 2 outer border strips. Okay, then my 9 little pieces that go in, I've then cut them from the remainder of the fabric. Now I've cut 5, so I have 10 strips instead of 9, off the remainder piece of fabric, and they're cut at the, like across the width of the fabric. So you're matching your selvages again and cutting like you would normally. So that's the discussion about all of this. Now, this is sort of what I was talking about. You would be cutting fabric B off the fabric first, cutting fabrics D and C parallel to the selvage, and then cutting anything out of here. Now I do have a massive chunk of fabric left, but black and white stripe gets used a lot, so no problems there. And I haven't decided what I'm doing to my backing just yet, so this will probably end up in the backing along with the leftover fabrics from the blocks, piece something together, and it'll end up being reversible at that rate. So I haven't quite got to that point yet, but I will when I get to there. But first of all, we want to join the strips. So I will set up the machine, I will sort everything out. Now I'm covered in threads, and we will get to joining everything together. Okay, so in order to work out what you want to do for your strips, you need to decide the order of your blocks. So if you haven't done that yet, stop and do that, because this is where you're going to have to make a decision where these strips will be attached. So first of all, we have 3 blocks across and 4 blocks down. We are joining a block to a strip, the strip to the block to the strip, and so on until we join a whole vertical row. So what we actually want to do is we want to make sure that we cut and sew these strips so that we don't have any fullness in the fabric. Now this is a technique that you will use throughout making every kind of quilt, measuring through the center vertically and horizontally and cutting a strip to that measurement. Now this is important because when it comes to loading a quilt onto a quilting frame, if you send your quilts to a long armor, if you've got fullness, that fullness will end up as a pleat or a pucker. Sometimes if it can't be gotten rid of, the quilters can turn it into like a hidden seam or a dart, that kind of thing. So if you prevent fullness in a quilt, you make it a lot easier for your long arm quilter, but also your quilts will sit a lot flatter. So what you want to do is you want to take the block that's going to be in your first block here, so the top left hand corner. So just for the sake of the instructions, we're going to go with this one. Now I want my pink plus to go this way. I want the longer strip to be across here, and I want my 2 smaller pieces to be there. What I then want to do is I want to take my tape measure and I want to make sure that this quilt is the 12.5 that I made it at, and I'm measuring through both, think I need to iron this one a bit more. So it is. So what I want to do is I want to take one of my strips that I have pre-prepared, and I'm going to cut that at 12.5. Now it's 2.5 inches wide. Pop it onto my cutting mat. Line it up on the 0 line that's over here, that's just off camera, and then come along and measure at the 12.5 line. Okay. Now, what I'm then going to do is I'm going to flip it over, and at the moment it looks a little bigger. Now this is what I'm talking about with the fullness. Fullness is when, what happens is when a fabric is stretched. So what happens here is, what I want to do, I'm just going to flip this way because I'm right-handed, so I prefer pinning up this way. I'm going to pin that edge, and then I'm going to pull this back and pin it here. And you'll see there's sort of like it's got a mouth a bit. I'm just going to pop a pin roughly in the middle. And then what I'm going to do is, when I put this on my machine, I'm actually going to sew it with this strip down onto the feed teeth. And the reason for that is that I want to slightly stretch the quilt block to ease in this strip. This will then square up everything that I need to, and there will be no fullness. If I had just whacked a strip on like this, that was a bit bigger, stitched it and cut it back, I can guarantee it will be the wrong size. And what happens is, it's sort of like a slight deception. The fabric gives you a sort of a misread on itself, and then what happens is people overstretch it, they overthink it. There's just a slight pull. You don't even notice you're doing it until somebody says something to you, and then you stop and reassess it. So this is what we're going to do, and set up all of our blocks so we can set up basically 9 blocks. So we go this one here, so everything in the first row, everything in the second row, and everything in the third row will all have a strip attached to it like this. So you can go ahead and prepare all of those, and we can chain piece them, so it's like a batch job. And then what we're going to be doing is coming back, and we will press them all. So I'm going to go turn the camera off now. I'm going to do all of this. So remember, measure through your quilt block horizontally in the center. So measure here or here. Don't measure on the edge, because if you measure on the edge, you're going to measure a stretched edge. It's a moving target. So if you measure through the center, it's stable. There's less give in the center here than if you were to do an edge. So if you look here, if I pull that, you can see the flare. If I pull that, you can see the flare. In the center, or even along a seam, there is give, but it's more stable than if you were to do, say, grab your tape measure, because a lot of people do this. They'll measure, and what they'll do is they'll pull as they measure. And so what happens is they get a misread on that. But if you just put it flat and measure through the center, you will get the correct measurement. So prep your 9 blocks with their first piece of sashing. Make sure everything's cut to size, and then we'll come back to the machine and chain piece everything. Okay, so here we have our blocks all pinned, our 9 blocks, so 3 blocks set aside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place them on my leg, and then I'm going to 1/4 inch seam each strip. Now I've got my standard settings on my machine: universal 80 needle, black thread, 1/4 inch foot, and I'm going to make it scant, so I'm just going to move it over a fraction. And because I've pinned on the other side, I will stop and remove pins as I go. So I'm just going to take the first pin out. And what I want to do is, most of these blocks were okay. There's no gappiness, so it'll just be those couple that are slightly out. And just sew your sashings on. Now that last pin wasn't in the road, so I wasn't too worried. Now this was the block that I was talking to you about in the beginning, and you can see here there's just a little bit extra puffiness. So what I'm going to do is position the first bit, a couple of stitches, and just remove that first pin. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pinch and hold the end and let the feed teeth just slightly gather the bottom section. Now I'm just holding it gently. Just going to remove that pin. So now I'm just going to hold this section a little bit more firmly than I was before. Let the feed teeth do the work for you. So all my other blocks were pretty much on target. Now I'm not removing pins here because I'm just feeling where they are. I'll remove one if it's in the road, but it also helps to do it this way so you can keep your seam allowances in the right position so they don't flip. And just go through and do all of your 9 blocks. And then pop your iron on and we will press the seams and we will reposition for the next section. Okay, so what you want to do now is you want to take all of your blocks and you want to press the seam. Now I'm going to press all of my sashing seams in towards the block, and the reason for that is that I don't want shadows to appear behind. Now you need to give your blocks a good press at this point. If you've got any lumps and bumps, any extra threads, make sure you do them as you go. So press the seam on each one. You can set the seam as we did on some of the other blocks, the other seams. That's up to you. And don't forget, if you do have too much shadowing, you can grade the seams as we've spoken about before. So just go along and do all of those, and then we will go to the next step. Okay, so here you can see I've got the first row. So if we go back to my nice little sketch, so this is our first row here. So I've got the snowball block, the rail fence, the donut, and my flying geese at the bottom here. So what I want to do now is I want to join the sashing to the next block. So sashing to the block, sashing to the block, and that will create my first row. So same situation as before. Place, pin in your 3 positions, do a pair, and then take your next row, your next block, sorry, and pin. So now do this for your 3 rows. So they'll all be in pairs. And this is following the layout that you've decided for yourself. So set that up and then back to the machine for some more chain piecing. Okay, so same method as before. Place the sashing section to the bottom where your feed teeth are. And just gently ease in. So repeat this for all blocks, back to the iron, and then pin the next section. Okay, so here we have a row. So it's the 2 pairs, so this is the vertical row, so this is actually the 2 pairs. So we're just going to pin and sew this final join between all 3 rows, and then we press the seams again, and then we will measure and cut our verticals that will run in the center of the piece. So pinning, I've already pinned the other 2, so pin this last one. So remember to match up each end. Check for any fullness, and then pop a pin in the center and allow any fullness to settle. Stitch that last seam. So we're just stitching this last seam. Then we'll do the 2 other rows. And then we will prep our verticals. Okay, press those seams and I'll meet you back at the cutting mat. Okay, so here we have our 3 rows, all pressed, all sashed on the horizontal. So now what we want to do is we're going back to our map, and we're going to be focusing on the 2 vertical strips that are going to join the 3 rows together. Now these 2 vertical strips are going to be labelled as piece C, which are meant to be about 54 inches. Now that was my rough estimate with when I was preparing everything earlier. So what we want to do now is we want to decide whether we want the black or white strips that I was talking about before. So here we have the white on the edge. So I'm going to use these ones because I'm not too worried about black, white or otherwise. So I'm just going to remove one of the rows so I've got a bit more room on the table. The table's not overly massive. And then I'm just going to separate the rows so you can see the gap in the table. Now, this is the strip. Now this strip is a little over 60 inches, I think, from memory. So that's where it's going to run. I'll just grab the camera and pull back a bit so you can see. So that's how it's going to run. So what I want to do now is I'm going to measure through both the center of this strip and this strip, and then cut this to the size. So if I get two very different measurements, then I will find a happy medium between the two, but I will see how I go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just do one at a time. So I'll just pull this one away, grab my tape measure, remove everything else out of the way. Now I don't mind that my strip is hanging off my cutting table. I don't have a lot of room, so I will just measure. So center and measure through, and we are at 53 3/4. So I'll just double check, make sure everything's flat. Yep, 53 3/4. So that's pretty much what I was thinking with the 54, and it will just allow for any discrepancies in the movement of the fabric. Now this is the row that's going next to that other row. This is the this row is my center row. Okay, sorry, brain fart right there. Okay, so we take it through the center again. Make sure our tape's right on that edge. And we're a tiny bit bigger, but only by 1/8. So that's pretty spot on. So I'm going to cut it at 53 3/4. So I will cut that strip down. So take this one away, get my strip that I want and a pin, and get a pin you can see like that contrasts with your fabric, because that's the next bit. So lay the strip out. I have a pin in my mouth, don't do that, but I just need an extra hand. So through the center of the strip, find your 53 3/4 and mark with your pin. Now trim that off. So what I like to do is once I've marked it with a pin, it's just so that while I'm doing other bits, it's out of the way. I then line up my ruler and take the pin away. Okay, so we now have our strip that's 53 3/4, and we're going to join our two strips together. So we want to get our center strip and you only have to do this one at a time. So same method as we did our little strips. Pin your corner and your other corner, and then find a center point, and then just rough pin in other sections. So let me just turn this around. So I don't like pinning upside down. So now you're all probably going, what is she talking about? She's been saying for months and months, no pinning. This is one of the times I will pin, because this is important that this is right. I will pin in certain junctions. I will pin on triangles and things like that. But you have to use the judgment call of how you're going to do your project. So first corner, other corner, and then somewhere in the center. So our center is actually this sashing here. So lay it out as flat as you can, and then just pop a pin in where that center is, and then get it as best you can. And I sort of pin like a hand apart when I do this sort of thing, because I'm going to be trying to ease in. So you can see here, this is what's happening, because this is a tiny bit short, and also because I've just dumped it off the edge of the table. So I just pin in an odd gap, give myself a bit of room, and now you can see it started to work. The selvage that was on this black and white stripe was also very tight. Let me just show you. I think it may have had a polyester thread or something through it. It's really quite, and it's not flat. So I'm not sure, but that's my guess. So now, same deal with the others. Sew this seam down the full length and ease in any of that fullness. Then press the seam, same as we did before, and then attach the other row. Okay, so our sashing seam is attached, and we've now got our other row. And we're going to pop that row, pin it along the sashing. Same method. And I'm going to find my center, and then fill in, continue pinning and fill in that fullness. Now the other thing you can do too, to make sure that you are getting your little sashings matched up, let me just pop this into camera view, is if you fold back your row and align your seam allowances, and you can do it from this side as well, line up the seam allowances and then pin this in place. Now I will use 2 pins just so that you can keep it, and then you can feel that the fullness can be managed in a section, and that way when you flip this back, this will line up and your blocks will match up where they're supposed to. So match up your tiny sashings, pin, and then join your next seam. Okay, so we've joined that seam and pressed the seams for this one. We are now going to join our next strip to this row, and once again measure through the center. So our 53 3/4. I've already measured both these strips, so I just have to measure this strip and cut it to size, and then join it and join these two together, and then we are on to our outer border. Okay, so here we have our last strip being attached. Now just to showcase again, I've pinned in opposite corners, so each far end, and I'm where the cross sashings are, I'm lining up so that I can get my matching seams. And remember, 2 pins to hold them in place, and then we will sew that seam, press the seam, and then we will come back to do our top and bottom borders. Okay, so now we're at a stage where we need to measure our top and bottom borders from the 2 strips that we had cut at the very beginning. So now that we've pieced all of this section and it is now been ironed flat, we take our tape measure and we measure through, and we have a 40-inch strip. Now you can do this at any point through the center of the quilt, except don't do it at the top edge where you run the risk of stretching. So pick somewhere. I usually go along a seam line, so somewhere where I've got a sort of a more stable area. Just pick one there. So we have a 40-inch strip. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take from where my selvage is, so on the edge of the black line, which I will trim off in a second, and I'm going to measure and cut where 40 inches is, which is just a fraction in off this black line here. Now I'm also, while I'm here, going to measure the bottom of the quilt in the same manner. So through where there's a seam, and I've got 40 inches again. So I can cut both of my strips that I have had prepared to 40 inches and then move to the next step. So grab both strips and my cutter. So first of all, I'm going to take the selvage off the one where I put the pin in, so I know it's along that black line, and then I'll turn it around to where the pin is, pop my ruler on it, and as I move the pin, okay, so that's my top. Now I might pop that pin in so I know that that one's the top, and then get rid of the scrap, and then I'm going to do the second one. So same deal again, take off the selvage, turn it over, and measure my 40. Pin. And the orange pin is for the bottom. So now I'm going to pin them to the quilt in the same method as I've done before. Just get rid of bits I don't need. Okay, so you can pin both of these sections at the same time, and the reason for that is because you can, they're separate, so there's no need to try and pin them because they're not, there's not another step after it that you have to sew. Sorry, brain's not fully working. So same process, one corner to one corner, actually I'm going to pin this from the other side. So one corner to one corner, Don't have to line anything up at this point except the corners. If you wanted to be really careful about your direction, you could line up your stripes this way, but they may not line up in terms of the measurement, the mathematics, but that is an option if you wanted to. So we find a center point, make sure we're as flat as we can be. If there's any fullness, just adjust for that. So I've just moved a bit of the fabric this way and that's ready. Flip it over and add the one to the bottom. So match the corner. If you've got any fabrics that have shifted slightly, you can trim those off. I did have a little bit of movement in one of these pink homespuns. Just decided to give me a little bit extra at the bottom here. So go back to the machine, sew those, then press the seams, and we'll be back for the side borders. Our top and bottom borders have been attached, their seams have been pressed, and now we have to measure through the center again vertically to get the measurement for our side borders. So once again, tape measure, pick a point and measure through. Okay, so 57.5 inches. So take one of our strips, now remember, when you're doing all of this, do not stretch the fabric. Okay, 57.5. And that will be the right border. And we go flip the quilt over. Now I'm not just cutting them to the same size because there are so many blocks and so many variables. I'm making sure that I'm cutting the best measurement for that part of the quilt. So repeat here. No stretching. And we have the same. So cut both of your side borders to your measurement, then pin them in the same method that we've been doing, stitch, and then press the seams, and that is all of our sashings done. Okay, so here we have our quilt, all sashings and borders, inner borders put on. So what we will do next time is we will attach our final outer border, and it's using the same method, but I want to have a quick chat to you about a couple of other techniques, and then we can go from there. So that is getting your quilt to an assembly point. You could leave it at this stage if you wished, quilt it and bind it with that sashing as your border, but it's up to you. So I will leave you here and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.